The signal says that this Google Hangout is on air, so welcome everybody to our latest Google Hangout given to the members and colleagues of the National Center for Victims of Crime. My name is Susan Howley, and I'm the Public Policy Director here at the National Center. With all that's been happening with the VCO Fund in the past few weeks, we thought it was time to give a general update to the field. I'm sure you've received many email alerts or updates from us and our colleagues so that you have some sense of what's going on, but we thought it would be a great opportunity to give a verbal update and give you all an opportunity to ask questions. So speaking of asking questions, we're going to be using the Q&A function of the Google Hangout. So for those of you who are new to Google Hangouts, if you look at the top of your screen, you should see something that looks like a little Rubik's Cube. Click on that and you'll see an option to click on Q&A. And that's how I'll be taking your questions. So today we're going to go through what happened with the budget deal in Congress. What was that effect on the VCO Fund? What does that mean for appropriations this year, and where does the process stand? But before we do that, we need to do a little bit of background just to make sure everyone is on the same page. I keep using the term VCO Fund. Some of you out there might know this as the Crime Victims Fund. And I do apologize for those of you for whom this is going to be really repetitive, but we want to make sure everyone has the same basic understanding. So the VCO Fund, remember, the Crime Victims Fund, was created back in 1984 as part of the Victims of Crime Act. And under that act, all criminal fines on federal offenders are collected, put into a special account, and from that, money is released that goes to fund crime victim compensation, crime victim services, various services at the federal level, and an automated notification system, and a couple of other things. The bulk of the money, as most of you know, comes out to the states, and most of that is used for direct services for victims of crime. Now, initially, all of the money that was collected into the fund was dispersed from the fund. But back in 2000, we collected, or the federal government collected, close to $1 billion. And that was more money than had been collected previously, and Congress decided, rather than have a fund where the disbursement goes up and down every year, let's hold some of that back for a rainy day and make the releases more predictable. So over time, since about 2000, the disbursements from the VCO Fund were around, well, in 2000, they were around 500 million. From 2000 to 2014, they gradually increased each year to about 745 million. During that time, however, much more money came into the fund than was dispersed, and the balance in the Crime Victims Fund rose to a little more than $12 billion during that time. Then last year, as most of you know, Congress released an amount that was much closer to the average amount collected over the past 3 years, and that was $2.36 billion. So I think now we're all caught up, right? We have a VCO Fund with around $12 billion in it. As of last year, much higher releases in funding. We came into this year, it looked like we were going to have a similar high release, and then about a month ago, or in the last month, Congress finally struck that budget deal. Remember, over the past several years, because Congress and the White House had not agreed on an overall budget deal, we had been suffering from sequester, right? That kept the caps on federal spending at an artificially low level, and that was really hurting a lot of programs that we all care about, right? Research, education, health spending, legal aid, all kinds of things that were important. So we were all really pleased when a budget deal was finally struck. However, as part of that budget deal, in order to get everyone on the same page, $1.5 billion was taken from the crime victims account, the balance on the VCO Fund, and that was used to pay down the deficit or pay toward the deficit. So This came as a surprise to all the victim advocates in town and to many people in Congress. They did not know that this was coming. One of our biggest fears was that this might now open it up to repeated raids, and we hope that won't happen. We're all standing ready to make sure that does not happen again. And we were assured that this $1.5 billion theft, rescission from the Victims Fund would not affect the amount that went out to victim services. We were told it had nothing to do with the VCO Cap or the disbursements from the fund. This was just taken from the balance of the fund. However, we soon began to hear that the cap or the disbursements from the VCO fund for the coming year would drop down to $1.2 billion. So that means that we would be going from the $2.36 billion we got last year to $1.2 billion. Now, many people in Congress thought that would be plenty because, after all, when you look at what we had been receiving, around $745 million, to them, $1.2 million still looked like a significant increase. But unfortunately, that really shows a lack of understanding here in DC about how tight victim funding had been and how desperately needed that VCO increase was. Because VCO spending had been capped so severely from 2000 to 2014, there was really a constriction on victim services. And many of you lived through this and in fact are just now starting to see some relief. So that money that came to states was not, it looked like it was growing from 2000 to 2014, but it actually, especially since 2002, started to feel like, no, 2006, started to feel like a reduction in spending because more money was being taken for management and administration by the Department of Justice, because more of the monies that come off the top of the fund for certain federal programs were increasing a little bit. States felt a real decrease in funding between 2006 and 2012. And I'm afraid we don't have great numbers from 2014 and 13 and 14, which is why I'm using the 2012 numbers. But we were actually serving fewer victims, about 630,000 fewer victims with that VCO money by 2012 than we had been in 2006, because, as I said, we saw these other amounts that were coming off the top restricted, and the amount that went to victim services actually decreased over that time. Now, because of that, as many of you know, state VCO administrators prioritized keeping the doors open for existing services. So that meant that the same groups tended to be funded year after year, but even those groups were not being well funded. Not only was the recession going on, so state funding and private funding was decreasing, but with this reduced VCO funding, what we were seeing was that local programs were operating with staffing levels that were really too low to meet the demand. And more than that, with staffing salary and benefit levels so low and unable to move that programs were losing experienced staff. It was just too hard to keep people after a few years because they could not pay a living wage. More than that, programs were cutting wherever they could. So we saw programs closing their satellite offices, focusing all their attention on their main office, cutting staff training down to nothing, not able to upgrade their computer systems, really not able to do anything to improve services, just keeping going with the VCO funding that was out there. And those were the programs that were getting the VCO funding. So at the same time, states weren't able to meet the new demands that we'd been recognizing, right? We weren't able to fund programs for victims with disabilities and the trafficking victims and the elder abuse victims, tribal victims. We weren't doing much for survivors of homicide. Really, all of these new needs and victims were not being served with VOCA funding because there just wasn't enough VOCA funding to fund something new without cutting something that was vital that was already in place. So now the states have received this significant bump up in VOCA spending. That was just a blessing nationwide. And people have been planning how are they going to use that funding. The states are all each are in a slightly different position with their VOCA spending and planning. Some states had funding to begin planning in advance. Others had no funding to start their planning processes until they received this increased VOCA funds. And that increase, as you all know, only just hit the states a couple of months ago. But we're now starting to see just how needed this funding was and the wonderful uses that it's being put to. We're seeing how vital it is. So states are funding some immediate things, like giving existing programs a little bit more money for extra staff, or some more money to do the technology upgrades that will allow them to do things like online chat and better tracking of their data, and bringing in some outcome measurement programs. We're also seeing real plans to fill gaps, to fund those needed legal services for victims. We're seeing funding for for interpreter banks for victim services. We're seeing funding for trafficking programs, for tribal victims, for elder abuse victims, and plans for training that will make sure that all of these new victim service providers that we're able to bring on board are really offering high quality service and are well connected to one another. What's more, this funding is allowing states to work with all of the stakeholders, victim service providers, criminal justice officials, members of the community group, to really figure out who have we missed, how are we going to reach and serve the victims who have traditionally or historically been left behind. They're talking about new ways to improve our ability to reach and serve victims. But if the VOCA funding drops back down to 1.2 billion, we won't have the ability to do this, to expand the existing programs, to fill those gaps that were needed, and to institute these new initiatives to build the capacity of all victim service providers. So where does that put us right now? Well, following the striking of that budget deal, matters have now gone back to the appropriations committees. For us, for the VOCA Cap, that means that the CJS, the Commerce, Justice, and Science and Related Agencies subcommittees, are looking at rewriting the spending bills for fiscal year 16. You may recall that the short-term spending bill that's in place runs out December 11th. If you count backwards, that means that the appropriation subcommittees have to finish their work before Thanksgiving. So that means that we, victim advocates, have only between now and Thanksgiving to let Congress know how important this VOCA funding is to all of us, why it's important to keep that cap high, what that level of funding means for us and for our programs. So now is the time to contact your senators and your representative and let them know, how are you using the VOCA funds? How important is it to you, to your state, to your community? And ask your senator, your representative, to speak to the Appropriations Committee and keep that VOCA cap, the disbursements from the Crime Victim Fund, high. Now I have here a list of members of the CJS subcommittee. Take a look at this list. If you see someone from your state on that list, that's who you should particularly target with this message. If you don't have a representative on either the Senate or House CJS subcommittee, contact your senators and representative anyway, make your case, and ask them to contact the Appropriations Committee. Because Congress is also home right now for Veterans Day, this is a great time to call their local office and try to arrange a visit, to have them come out to your program and see firsthand the great work that you are doing with your VOCA dollars. Or if you're not yet getting VOCA dollars, the money that you could be using. Let me go to one more screen to show you how you can find your members of Congress. Open Congress, this website, has a great feature. If you click on that link, that's www.opencongress.org/people/zip code lookup, you'll be able to find your senators and your representative, and it'll show you their phone number and how to email them. And now I have time to take some questions. So please use that Q&A box and let me know what I missed, what you'd like me to go back over again, and any questions that you have about the VOCA Fund. Going to assume people are typing. Nothing's coming through yet. All right, I'll give people just a few more seconds. You know, I don't mind sharing my personal email with you if you don't get an opportunity to ask a question today. So you can just send that to Showley, that's SHOWLEY, at NCVC for National Center Victim Crime.org, and I'll be happy to answer your questions then. All right, I am not seeing any questions, so I'm going to take that as a sign that this was a very thorough explanation of what's going on with the VOCA Fund. If not, as I said, do reach out to me personally and I will get back to you. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today and for all that you do every day for victims of crime. Thanks.